We want to take a look now at how the speech was received and the impact it might have. Jim Wallis is an evangelical writer for Sojourners magazine and author of The Great Awakening. Debra Dickerson, a columnist for MotherJones.com, and Jeff Greenfield is our CBS News senior political correspondent. Jim Wallis, let me start with you. Obviously, Obama's association with Jeremiah Wright was creating problems for him. According to a new CBS poll, 30% of all registered voters said that Wright's statements made them view Obama less favorably. So did he do enough today to distance himself from some of Jeremiah Wright's more controversial comments?
Well, Katie, this isn't about just a campaign or an election. It's about the country and about the choices that we're going to make. It's about the anger and frustration of the past and the possibility of a new direction. Obama is a new generation. I hope every American listens to or reads this speech. And if this is a vision of a more perfect union, as he said, take him at his word. He understands the anger of the past, the frustration of the present in the black church, and Jeremiah Wright was speaking out of that. The man's whole career was boiled down to 4 angry sound bites, and Obama distanced himself from that, but he said, we can do better. It's possible to change these things, and he offered his vision, and America should read it and make their own decisions.
And Debra, in fact, he did talk a lot about the lingering anger in the African-American community as a result of past injustices, claiming the anger is real, it is powerful. Do you think that Jeremiah Wright speaks for many African-Americans in this country, even at his angriest?
I think even at his angriest, yes, he does speak for, I don't remember whether it's the id or the superego, but he is speaking from that non-reflective part of us that is still very angry about a lot of things and justifiably has a right to be angry about a lot of things. But I think Obama was brilliant in this speech and in so many ways, but he talked about the fact that that kind of anger, when it's allowed to get out of control, is obviously self-destructive, and it's also it's an insult to America. It talks about America as if there has been no progress, and that's why it's not useful. So you have to learn to understand when anger is hurting you and when anger can be legitimate. As Jesse Jackson said, you can't tell a man who's hurting how to holler, but hollering doesn't really get you anywhere. And I think now that the discourse, the religious discourse, which has always been a refuge of this kind of rhetoric, is going to have to do some soul searching and say, okay, now that people are paying attention, are these the words that I really meant to use?
Jim Wallis, obviously Obama needs the support of white voters. Is this side of the black experience, though, even if it's not the most productive, but if in fact still exists, does it make too many white voters uncomfortable? Is it too off-putting for them?
Well, Debra is right. The white elephant in the room here, you might say, I'm speaking as a white religious leader, is that many white Americans would be uncomfortable with what is said often in black churches. The black pulpit is a place of truth-telling about the experience of black people. Every week has to nurture the souls of people who feel beaten down and yet announce God's promise for the future. Barack understands that, and he is a new generation turning a page. He's saying we can't just be stuck in the past. The tragedy here, Katie, would be if the angry past brings down a more hopeful future. And Barack said in a speech, and it was a brilliant speech, he says, not this time. Let's not let the anger and the frustration bring down the possibility of finally moving forward here.
Jeff Greenfield, do you think this speech will put the Jeremiah Wright controversy behind him?
No. As a speech about race in America, it was a very effective, uncommonly frank speech. But the problem is what brought him to this point at this point in the campaign. I think for some people, even though they may be taken out of context, although I don't know how you take out of context the notion that AIDS was a government-created conspiracy, it's very much like one line that can define somebody, particularly somebody who's not as well known. Back in the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan said some things that were very controversial and sometimes silly, but people felt they knew him. Obama is still largely a blank slate who has been defining himself to a lot of people as a post-racialist guy, somebody who's speaking beyond that. And the question, I believe, is going to linger. It's going to linger in the fall if he's the nominee. It's going to be out there on websites. It's going to be in independent expenditures, if not McCain. How does a guy who spends 20 years with somebody with some notions that seem very bizarre like AIDS is a government conspiracy. What's he doing with that guy for 20 years? And I think for people who are looking at Obama as a new kind of guy, it sets up a kind of confusion. It's a question. Who is this guy really? And I don't think this speech, effective as it may be in other areas, ends that controversy for him.
What should he have done, Jeff, in the speech that he didn't, in your view? Or what could he have done that would have laid this controversy to rest?
I actually think, since he defined, as someone said, this elephant in the room in so many areas about race, I mean, the anger in black churches that we don't always hear, I think he could have taken that very specifically and to say, you know, I'm sorry, these particular statements are, and define them and tell them what they are, but then he still doesn't answer the question that some people will be asking: why was this guy your mentor when for the last several years he has been saying things that seem so out of phase with who you, Barack Obama, are? I'm not sure it's the words that would have made a difference. It goes back to the fundamental question, why associate yourself with this man? I know what he said. I do think there's a difference between disowning your grandmother and disowning a pastor.
Debra, of course, the Obama campaign has really made an effort to make this candidacy transcend race. Is there a concern or a fear now with this speech that it will make race front and center, not only in the campaign, but potentially in his presidency if he gets a nomination and is elected?
Well, this notion of transcending race, I think, really has to boil down to a notion of who can talk about race in a way. We're a long way from race being off the table, but who can talk about race in a way that acknowledges what all the different sides are saying, finds a way to synthesize them, name names, and hold people accountable, while providing a place to bring us together and move us forward. So I think that's what, I do think that it can't be that he can never talk about race, or that he has to apologize and disown everything about race that makes white people uncomfortable. We do have a right to be angry about some things. Women have a right to be angry about some things. Immigrants have a right to be angry about some things. And you can't ask people to transcend their own particular identity by refusing to talk about it and by giving other people a free pass. So I think that what he's doing is forcing us to confront our demons in a very transcendent, Martin Luther King kind of way, from basic transcendent notions. And I thought his speech was beautiful. It really was beautiful. And it was hard-hearted in a lot of different ways, and it was very gracious in a lot of different ways. He very specifically said, stop picking on Geraldine Ferraro. She's not a deep sea. She's not a racist. He rebuked his pastor but said, I'm not going to disown him. Transcending race can't mean I'm going to jettison everything that white people don't like or makes them uncomfortable. That's not transcending race. That's putting yourself in a closet.
What about Jeff Greenfield's contention that there are still a lot of issues about his association with a guy for 20 years who was his spiritual mentor, who does say some pretty unconventional things? Do you think that will linger out there and cause people to really have some trepidation?
Yes, and the question is the significance of those trepidations. The argument that you can go to any church, any temple, any synagogue, and hear things from your minister, from your religious leader that you don't agree with or that you find appalling in some way. It's really interesting. I was born and raised a Southern Baptist, and I've heard for years things like that, and much more out there. And there's a sense that what happens in church stays in church. And I think it's a vestige of racism. Nobody took us seriously. Nobody cared what those colorful ministers were saying. Let's just hear the choir sing and move on. Now people are paying attention to what's said in those places, insofar as ministers and religious leaders have put themselves in the public sphere. And you don't have a right to say something and nobody can answer you back. And I think black religiosity is going to have to answer for the things that it says. But the people who go to those churches can't be required to agree with every word that comes out of the minister's mouth. But there's no doubt in my mind that politicized ministers are going to be rereading their sermon notes. You're going to start seeing a lot of blog entries from people who go to church and who hear these sorts of things. I think black religiosity is now being taken seriously, and seriously means that these statements are going to be scrutinized. And in the same way that he's being looked at for dealing with this Resco character, all the people in people's lives are going to be looked at. And the question is, what's out of bounds and what's in bounds?